Large-scale demonstrations against the West have been building across the Muslim world since the release of an internet film portraying the Prophet Muhammad in a derogatory and offensive way. Unsurprisingly, the prominent narrative resounding in the establishment following the wave of protests is of sweeping generalizations.
And you know why they hate us? Yeah, I talked to intelligence people all weekend. They hate us because of their religion. They hate us because of their culture, and they hate us because of peer pressure.
We are the spark. Our existence, our way of life is one long spark. They want to extinguish that spark. So we need to stop worrying about what sparks what and focus on protecting our citizens from this prehistoric evil. As Hillary Clinton said, these acts are confounding. True, it is confounding how unprotected our embassies are. What's not confounding are the attackers' motives. They hate us.
What kind of sense do you have about who exactly they are? I mean, are they part of an organized group, or are they just young men looking for trouble?
By and large, they seem to be young men looking for trouble.
Really, Scarborough? And Fox, they don't want to extinguish our way of life. They just want us to stop extinguishing their lives. Have any of these news commentators read about the history of U.S. foreign policy and interventionism in these regions for the last century? The other resounding line in the media has been one of utter perplexity. How could they hate us when the U.S. has been helping to spread democracy to these very same countries? Check out this clip from NBC's Richard Engel reporting from Egypt.
It is somewhat ironic that it was American diplomats inside the embassy who helped to give these demonstrators, these protesters, a voice and allowed them to actually carry out this anti-American clashes that we're seeing right now.
So, the U.S. gave a voice for protesters in Egypt. I think many would disagree with what Ingalls deems so ironic, considering how the U.S. is one of the biggest allies to the brutal dictator Hosni Mubarak for decades, giving him over $2 billion in foreign aid every year since 1979. The U.S. didn't take the line of the Egyptian revolution until it was already happening. Then, when the revolution was underway, Egyptians were brutalized, freed, with USA-made tear gas canisters by Mubarak's security forces. As Mike Preisner, Answer Coalition organizer, has so eloquently stated, he said, Muslims are not culturally backwards for attacking U.S. embassies. Americans are culturally backwards for not understanding why. Now, to think that the militant response is only due to an inflammatory film is extremely naive. Intense hostility toward the U.S. long predates this film, and the reasons are hardly difficult to recognize. Preisner goes on to explain in a recent editorial, these protests can only be understood by taking into account the historic role of imperialism, which has left a deep reservoir of anger toward the United States and other colonizers. Some of the actions have been the invasion of Iraq, support for brutal military dictatorships, arming and funding Israel for its non-stop war and occupation of the Palestinian people, notorious illegal torture and endless drone warfare, which targets civilians. Only by analyzing the backdrop of colonial violence in these regions can shed a light on how and why these things occur. But in large part, the historical and contextual amnesia of colonialism and imperialism is completely absent from the mainstream narratives. And these networks are just drooling at the mouth to be given a chance to push their familiar line of how evil and ungrateful these people are and how necessary the war on terror is to keep fighting. The commentators and politicians look at these protests unfolding and point to them as a sign of collapse and destabilization of their prehistoric societies. But interestingly, very similar things have been happening right here in the U.S. Check out some of the footage I got tear-gassed multiple times for during the Occupy Oakland crackdowns late last year. Is it just me, or does this look familiar? You see, you can't forget the unrest brewing in our country, because we too have a breakdown in society, which will only get worse as the gap continues to widen between the rich and the poor. Yet, you don't see much attention paid to our police state, the spirit of revolt, and the instability here at home. And while corporate outlets have been all too focused on the unruly protests across the Middle East, the anniversary of Occupy Wall Street has sparked another wave of protests and militarized crackdowns in New York City, where, get this, 181 demonstrators have already been arrested, including many for simply filming or sitting. So, Instead of focusing on how these Middle Eastern countries are falling apart at the seams because they're culturally backward, maybe the establishment should look at the glaring fact that this country is falling apart at the seams as we speak. And maybe they should work to fix the innumerable wrongs plaguing the people who live here before it escalates to the point where the unrest can no longer be marginalized or ignored.